Yeah, there really is a lot of misinformation and I'd say almost incorrect assumptions when it comes to home scale rainwater harvesting. Um, and let's keep diving into that. And I'm going to throw out some of the common questions, perceptions, comments that I routinely hear. And I've got a list that I'm going to throw at you. And let's keep. Peter, what about airborne pollutants, even herbicides, pesticide spraying in nearby industrial areas? One really common concern I hear or objection to wanting to harvest rain, especially in an urban area, are these airborne pollutants getting into my water, and will they harm me?
You know, there's a lot of discussion in the literature. Some of it, a lot of it, actually based on an early publication of myself and some of my colleagues, where we identified the airborne pollutants and the potential. However, um, as we've talked about, then those pollutants potentially fall on a roof, including herbicides and pesticides spraying in rural areas, for example. Uh, and then they're subjected to UV light, wind, washing off, blowing off, all sorts of other things go on, and including say a nearby industrial area, which is next to my home in Newcastle. Um, so yes, these things can hit your roof, but the same atmospheric conditions can actually change those contaminants on your roof. So everything that might hit your roof doesn't stay on your roof, and everything that might hit your roof doesn't actually end up in your rainwater storage. And as we talked about before, first of all, the atmospheric conditions actually are pretty good at maybe uh, deposition of things on your roof, like sediments and metals and, say, herbicides, but also very good at removing them from your roof before they end up in your rainwater storage. And then your rainwater treatment train has got these mechanisms in them to minimize this. So, for example, I worked with a rural public health unit nearly 20 years ago now, and they had aerial crop dusters. I'm not sure if they have these in Canada. I'm sure they do.
Yeah, yeah,
And they were spraying all sorts of nasties, which they don't spray anymore, fortunately. And
will
the
do here.
then the concerns are that, well, if you've seen a crop duster, they just spray everything. So the overspray from those will obviously get on the roofs of the farmhouses that are in the middle of the paddocks and nearby.
Hmm.
And the concern was, wow, they all live on rainwater because they've got no other rainwater supply. This must be a problem. Um, so what we actually found is, and what the public health units found is, yes, these overspray was ending up on these roofs, uh, but the action of sunlight and wind and other things going on was doing two things: removing those contaminants from the roof, or because of the sunlight and the UV processes, they were actually destroying the chemical compounds that were herbicides and pesticides.
I suppose it's a good. I mean, you think about it; those type of activities, spraying, aerial spraying, particularly, is really not going to happen on a rainy day, right? They're going to do that. Um,
It's a
you know,
really good point because we
yeah.
found, Michelle, that they'd never do it on a rainy day. So by the
Hmm.
time you get to the rainy day, there's a lot of sunlight and atmospheric processes going on that are removing a lot of these contaminants before it rains. And
Hmm.
it's an excellent point. And the next thing we're finding is as I was describing earlier on the treatment train, by the time the residual very low dose contamination, if any still existed, was in those drops of water entering the rainwater storage, The processes in the rainwater storage are actually removing it from the water supply. And when we tested the sludge, which is the biofilm we were talking about before, we found that the, that biofilm was actually removing any residual low concentrations of these contaminants. So what the public health units found in these farming areas is, yes, some of these pesticides and herbicides ended up in the biofilm, the sludge in the bottom of the tank, but they were not in the water column at any detectable limit. What that means is very, very low concentrations sometimes ended up in the storage, but the natural processes in the storage actually meant that they were eliminated from the storage. For instance, any low concentration residual contaminant would attach itself to a sediment, for example, and settle to the bottom and get bound up in its storage. So, but you do need to have that treatment train process set up properly, like we were talking about, which we did recommend. The same is happening for industrial areas, but doesn't mean you should ignore this risk. You should be aware of it. But what might fall on your roof doesn't necessarily equal what will end up in your rainwater supply. So we need to be careful of those assumptions. And if you have a carefully designed and managed rainwater treatment train in the middle of all that, you're probably going to be okay. And that's what the public health unit found.
Right. And same thought process when it comes to metals or pollutants leaching from your roofing materials, correct? To a point. I mean, you definitely don't want to be choosing materials that have, say, lead or, known known for polluting water. But on the other hand, that process, that natural treatment train, is going to significantly, especially in the storage, going to reduce the concentrations of those things.
Absolutely. One thing that did really jump out for us in 20 years of monitoring this stuff. So I'm talking about, careful what you're measuring, but we've been measuring for 20 years. So we've got thousands and thousands of data sets. If you had lead flashing on your roof, it's going to end up in your rainwater supply for sure. So that's a bit of a no-no. If you're not using your rainwater supply for drinking, it doesn't matter. So it comes back to your question before, Michelle, about should we just use potable or should we be talking about end uses? This is where it becomes very important. If you just assume potable, you say you can't use that rainwater supply for anything. If you assume that, my rainwater system's only for my garden and for flushing my toilet, not that I recommend you should have lead flashing on your roof, but it's really a non-issue for those uses. Not that you want to put too much lead on your garden, but it'd be low levels of lead. So we don't recommend lead flashing on roofs. And if you've got it there and you want a really good rainwater harvesting system, you probably should do something about it. Your rainwater harvesting
So go
system.
ahead. Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm reminded of a story that was told by a colleague of mine when he was I was sitting in a course that he was teaching about sustainable building design, and he mentioned a rainwater harvesting system that he put on a camp building in the woods for kids. And when they were finally doing their water testing at the end of the day to commission the system, they were finding lead beyond the appropriate levels in the water, and it took them a really long time to try and figure out what they had done wrong with the design of their rainwater harvesting system. And in the end, it turns out it was actually some fittings in I don't know exactly where the fittings were located, but there were fittings that had really nothing to do with this design of the rainwater harvesting system. They were fittings that were put in the plumbing system for this camp that were the culprit. And it wasn't until they replaced those fittings that when they redid the tests, they got rid of the lead. And he told the story as a cautionary tale about designing rainwater harvesting systems. And I took a little bit of, when I started thinking about it, I thought, oh, no, because even if that camp would have been on well water, those fittings had nothing to do with the rainwater system per se. It's an unfortunate reality of the materials we use in general with anything we put in our home, isn't it?
So we discovered this in our research programs. You're quite right. Poor quality fittings produce poor quality outcomes for all water, all sources of water. But let's examine this a bit. So people like bargains, right? They like to buy things, gone to, I don't know what sort of warehouses you have there, say Bunnings here. I'm going to get this nickel tap for my rainwater storage because it it costs $100 less than the good quality tap. So bargain, right? So what we found with those sorts of taps is there's a combination of nickel and lead in them. And in many rainwater harvesting systems, people are trying to claim there are huge problems. We actually found it was the tapware. And our solution was to tell these people to go and buy, unfortunately, a more expensive tap with a higher quality material in it. So rainwater harvesting systems have these, often have a tap in the side of them, the above ground ones, and that tap is the culprit, and that's where people have been testing from, because it's a poor quality nickel tap with
right, especially if it was put on an outdoor
yeah,
tank, right? Right.
yeah.
So that
And
would give
also,
you misleading results in terms of the quality of your actual water, and it's entirely due to your choice of tap.
and we found this in my own house where I had a PhD student measuring my house. I've had a few over 20 years, and he said, "Oh no, your rainwater's crap." Australian expression for not very good. And I said, "Where were you testing?" He said, "Oh, on your garden tap." And I said, "Well, go and test at my drinking water tap." And then he was coming back, "Oh, there's no metals here, but I'm getting lead and nickel." And I said, "Yeah, it's a poor quality outdoor tap." So, and it was nothing to do with the rainwater, it's the plumbing material. Also, there is good quality copper pipes and poor quality copper pipes. In the current era of commodity prices and scarcity, there's more and more poor quality copper plumbing materials on the market. Some of them used by project home groups. And no matter what your source of water, we're getting blue water out of them, particularly from mains water, because with chlorine in it, it's quite aggressive. Um, where your poor quality copper pipes will actually leach out copper. So copper is
Yeah, it's almost advisable for all people, anyone, to have a good quality microfilter at the tap, the drinking water tap, right? Yeah,
yeah,
no matter what your source of water is.
we do. So on the you mentioned asphalt roofs, so I'll preempt that one for you because there's a few of them over there and there's a few here. But I got to thinking about this, and I was in Western Australia last year for a conference, and the people from the Water Corporation were proud to show me this system I was once designing in. And my fault, I was completely unaware that one of their reservoir water catchments, they'd bitumen asphalted the entire catchment because it doesn't rain a lot in Western Australia, so there'd be more runoff to have more reliable water supply. So you'll need to do the imperial translation for me, but 40 hectares, they bitumen the whole catchment to maximise the runoff, asphalted the whole lot. And
that's the source water for their treatment plant?
yes, so and I, because before I saw that, I would have said to you, Michelle, don't touch it, very bad. And then only yesterday I was talking to a colleague in Brisbane who has some asphalt on his on one of his building roofs because he's got a storage is attached to all of his roofs now because we're running out of water in Australia, in case you haven't noticed. So all of a sudden these home scale systems are very valuable because it rains a lot more in cities here than it does out in the catchments where the water utilities try to get water from.
Right.
Long story, but so he was harvesting off his shed roof, and he said, "Oh, I got an asphalt roof," and I went, "Oh, you need to be careful about that." He said, "Yeah, but I got one of those leaf diverters that you really like, Peter, because our research shows they were really good." And he said, "Yeah, the water comes in a bit of a grey colour from the roof and comes out the other end of the leaf diverter clear." And I went, "Oh, it's good to know." So that's telling. And I said, "What are you using that water for?" And he said, "Oh, I'm only using it to flush the toilet in my shed and for my garden." And I went, "Well, that'll be okay." So aiming the water source at the right end use. You've got a lot of asphalt roofs over there, so um, it's not a fatal flaw for rainwater harvesting. We just need to, as we're going to do in this course, think about the right design.
Yeah, absolutely. Another really common question I get, and we've kind of touched on this already, but this concern around algae growing in the tank, or misunderstanding around what is algae, what is toxic. There's something in the bottom, there's something growing on the sides that's bad, it's going to hurt me, or will it hurt me? Yeah, I hear that a lot.
So this is one of these systematically misleading assumptions from somewhere else that's been applied to rainwater harvesting without evidence. Like algae, blue-green algae, for example, which is quite toxic, for example, is in high nutrient lakes, rivers, waterways. It's not in rainwater harvesting, and there's something really bad has gone wrong. So it's just when people are saying, "Oh, there's a bit of filamentous organic material in my tank," that's your biofilm, which is associated with a fungus, not an algae. And I've seen this everywhere where people have misidentified that in a rainwater storage as algae. But algae needs high nutrients, open sunlight. Um, it's very common to lakes and rivers. Almost doesn't exist or can't possibly exist in a rainwater harvesting storage. You could have a hot environment, you could throw away your rainwater storage and have no roof on it, and it'll have, say, a foot of water in the bottom that heats up, and for some reason all sorts of nutrients have ended up in there. I don't know how. And then you might get some algae in there, but in your normal operation, if you're seeing uh, something that you think is algae, it isn't. It's biofilm, and it's a different range of organic species around fungus, which are one of the building blocks of biofilms, and it's not algae. This question irks me quite a lot because this is what we've talked about so far today, is where something that's been found in a completely different area has just been applied to rainwater harvesting without any evidence. And this is one case where that's the case. If
What
you do
about,
have
is this also tied to some of the recommendations I've seen out there? I guess maybe the question is, does your tank need to be opaque? Is there any issues with sunlight getting into your tank? As long as we're following, the other design guidelines and recommendations we're going to talk about, screened inlets and outlets,
so
so on and so forth.
rainwater, a correctly designed rainwater harvesting system is a very low nutrient system. Even a badly designed one is low nutrient. But we want correctly designed ones. The potential for algae to grow in a tank is almost non-existent. Um, so light doesn't cause algae. It's the nutrient load that causes algae. Sunlight just helps it along. So warmth. So it's not sunlight on its own either. It's warmth that actually that drives it along. So the idea of having completely sealed tanks is actually quite counterproductive. It's okay to have a bit of light in there, but you certainly need some oxygen in there, because we had a case in Australia where people were putting bladder tanks under buildings where they just a bladder, if you like, and they're completely airtight, and they were getting some strange poor quality water outcomes. And after a fair bit of research, we found they were becoming anaerobic because they're completely sealed, because they said bladder tanks are really good because of all these misconceptions about rainwater harvesting. We don't want to let any light, oxygen or anything in there. And they went anaerobic, and they were actually become quite aggressive, and they're leaching materials out from the storage medium. Um, so you certainly need to have air get into your rainwater harvesting storage, which is obviously done by your connection system and so on, and light's not a bad thing. So.
All right, another quite common question I get, or else comment, is around annual draining, de-sludging, and chlorinating, giving the system a good clean. I should say storage, probably, not system, right?
I think that has come from a complete misconception about rainwater is. And I had that misconception when I started my PhD on rainwater harvesting about 2 decades or so ago. And I hopped into one of our storages, I emptied it, and I scrubbed and disinfected it. And it was the worst performing rainwater harvesting storage we had. It had the worst water quality for the following 4 years. And I need to write this up, but it's in my PhD, what we actually found is completely disrupted the natural system in the rainwater harvesting storage. So it was all of those natural balancing systems, rainwater ecosystems we now call it, they're in the other storages I was comparing it to, weren't in this one because we destroyed them all with all this chlorine and so on. And the storage was produced far worse water quality. And it was quite a surprise to me because, like you, I'd read all that stuff. And then when I thought about it, I thought, yeah, this is a hangover from assumptions that, false perceptions of how bad rainwater is. So you need to hit it with all the disinfectant and everything else with the storages. So basically, no. If you're storing rain barrels and not using them for a long period of time, sure, clean them out if you want to, but if you're actually using them and they're online and they're part of your system, don't get in there and scrub them with chlorine. It'd be very counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
I personally don't think homeowners should be mucking around with chlorine anyway because it's a poison, but I've already talked about that.